Thanks very much, Chair, and thanks to the NTA. I listened into some of your responses, Ms. Graham, and I mean, just to say, on the 15-year rule, if I heard you correctly, you're saying that you can't make a decision on that, or a decision won't be made on that until public consultation is concluded. Now, that is putting huge numbers of taxi drivers in a very difficult situation, because they're getting very near a cliff edge in terms of the age of their vehicle, and they are facing the prospect of having to make decisions about the purchase of new vehicles at the beginning of next year. So what I don't really understand, given that, is why do we have to have a consultation on this issue at all? And if you're tied into it, can we not get an indication, or who has to give the indication, that either the NTA, the government, the department, or both are going to look favourably on what is an eminently reasonable request by the taxi drivers? Because, let's just remember, the taxi drivers were absolutely hammered during COVID, right? Hammered. Their business collapsed. Their ability to make income, for some, they didn't feel safe being on the road at all. For others, they continued to work, continued to hold together a public transport system. They had to fight very, very hard to be acknowledged, their plight. Let's just remind ourselves of that. 4 taxi groups had to mobilise on the streets. Some of us had to push very, very hard to even have their case heard here in the Dáil at the COVID committee and so on, for the supports that they needed. And if they hadn't fought, they would have got very little support, if any, because initially they were left out of supports. But they have taken a 2-year-long hammering, which makes it far more difficult, facing that cliff edge that they're facing in terms of what money they could have accumulated during that period in order to deal with the 10-year rule. And, I mean, to me, I just don't even understand the 10-year rule. I mean, if any other car passes the NCT and is suitable for the road, that's it. They're able to drive on the road. And yet, for some reason, taxi drivers are singled out as a group that have to jump over an additional hurdle. And I don't really see the rationale for it whatsoever. If the car can pass an NCT, the car should have the right to be on the road as a taxi. And indeed, taxis that are adapted for disability do have a 15-year. So there's not even the same standards applied to all taxi drivers. So part of that question then is, there were some extensions, again, as a result of pressure from the taxi drivers themselves, to the rule during COVID. Not the 15 they're now looking for, but some extensions. Did they require statutory instrument? Who made that decision? And is it not possible simply to do that now? And who could do it now? Because I believe it should be done now. It is absolutely clear that's what all the taxi drivers are asking for, and it is a very, very fair request, further strengthened by the fact that you cannot get electric vehicles out there in the quantities that people might want, who want to switch, because they're just not there. And indeed, one of the points the taxi drivers said is the NTA and the government should actually be going out themselves to assist in the procurement of electric vehicles. Given the sort of, the priority government is giving, rightly, to climate change, climate action and so on, but where the drivers themselves are experiencing, difficulty, if not it being simply impossible to get electric vehicles, what efforts are being made by the state itself to go out and get the vehicles that would be necessary in order for taxi drivers to make that transition. But in the meantime, it seems to me it's well past time that the NTA, the government, should indicate that the taxi drivers will get that extension, which is very reasonable, that they're looking for. And on the Taxi Advisory Committee, I mean, look, the 4 major groups representing taxi drivers in this country have voted with their feet. They do not feel the Taxi Advisory Committee represents them, and they want the right to negotiate directly with the NTA and with the department about the issues that affect them. And nobody knows better the issues that affect them than the taxi drivers themselves. And does it not tell us everything about the fact that the Taxi Advisory Committee is not fit for purpose when the 4 major groups representing taxi drivers in this country do not wish to be part of it? I mean, that tells us something. And, you know, do the NTA recognise that there's a serious problem when that is the case, and that they need to talk directly to the taxi representatives groups in that regard? And lastly, you know, I would just say that, you know, if we didn't know before, we should certainly know after COVID, and we should certainly know now, given there's been some difficulties in terms of, you know, the taxi fleet and, you know, people complaining, that, you know, this is an industry to one extent that is regulated in that, you know, the state decides how much a taxi driver can charge, for example, but it's the only part of the public transport system which is not seriously subsidised in the way that other parts of the public transport system are. Now, if we value taxi drivers and the taxi industry as an integral, vital, unique, which it is, part of the public transport system that performs a role in the public transport system that no other part of that transport system can play, surely we have to be talking about giving bigger supports and proper subsidies to actually to support that industry, to make it viable, to make it attractive for people to be part of it. And the call for the transferability of licences is part of that. It's not the only part of it, but it is part of trying to make it an attractive industry for people to stay in and to facilitate, you know, people who might want to stay if their father is a taxi driver and they're, you know, sharing the taxi with them as a cozy or whatever, and then want to take over that taxi place. Surely we should be listening to the taxi drivers and their reasonable request that transferability would be there in order to make being a taxi driver and being part of that industry an attractive option for people.
Ms. Graham, Mr. Cregan.
So just, in terms of the public service vehicles and the 10-year age that was the original rule, which had been extended a number of times as an emergency measure during COVID, so to the extent, as I set out in my opening statements, that no car had to leave the industry because of age through that COVID period. And that was done by SI, by regulatory change, because that's what's set out in the Act, in the Taxi Regulation Act. It says where the authority proposes to make regulations under this Act, it shall publish on its website a draft of the proposed regulations stating that representations may be made in writing to the authority not later than 21 days or such further period as the authority allows from the date of publication, and consider any representations made to it and make the regulations with or without any modification. So that's set out in our legislation. We've got no choice. It says we shall publish it and seek representations.
So did you seek submissions on the previous extensions?
In terms of, yeah, all the extensions and the regulations that were changes that were made through the COVID period were done as emergency measures, but they had to follow the same regulatory process. So similarly now we're responding to a particular contingency where fleet, whether it's second-hand fleet or even new electric fleet, is not available in the market. We do have as well an issue that the industry hasn't recovered post-COVID, and we still a high demand for services in our cities. So the combination of those issues has meant that we've got to regulate for that external environment, which we are in now post-COVID, and that's why we're now further extending the vehicle age through this proposed regulation, which is now is out for public consultation.
So you just expand on that.
So what's proposed is to extend the vehicle age again to allow vehicles
to 15 years.
Up to 15 years, yes.
So are you out on public consultation on
that now? Yeah.
When
Started
did you go
on Monday. Monday.
Okay, so it's very fresh.
It's very fresh, yeah.
And just, I'm sorry for coming in.
That's fine.
So just go through the process for us, because what we got from the taxi drivers that were in before us was a couple of things. On a practical level for them, right?
Yeah.
So they've come through COVID, and I use taxis like everyone else. Get the train to Dublin, invariably get a taxi across. And many of them are going towards the EV car route.
Yeah.
It's attractive, however, the time scale is very late. Two things are happening. Number one, their existing car is going over the 10-year age group, and in many cases, number two, their licence is going out, and when their licence is out, they can't drive. And so the question is, what they're asking really is a transitional measure that will allow. They were looking at a 15 years extension on the age of the car, and they were looking on the basis that if they've applied for an EV vehicle and there's a delay in the EV vehicle coming, that there will be some moratorium put on their licence to extend it to enable them to drive until they get the EV car, and our understanding is they can only apply for the licence if they have the new car. And one of the consequences here is that in some cases they'll be so desperate to drive that they won't go the EV route. They'll invest in another car that they probably can't afford, which will not be an EV car. And they're very, very upfront that the EV car grants that are available for them are very welcome. And they're very honest about that, right? And that's very positive, right? So they're asking for that transitional measure to just allow them to make their living, go the EV route. And if the EV cars, and they were really talking about that, if they were in some way given a parallel lane where they could get EV cars in a quicker way, but obviously that's a different thing. So therefore it comes back into the process. So I know I cut you, Ms. Graham, but I just wanted to give context.
Can we just make a distinction between those that are in the industry at the moment, Chairman? Because I think the representatives that you were hearing last week were representing existing drivers. So in terms of moving towards an EV and being able to do that, they have a current driver and a vehicle. And this extension, proposed extension, which is part of the regulatory, will allow them then to retain their vehicle until it gets to a point where there are more electric cars available that they can avail of the grant. Subject to the department now doing another grant next year, you know, that's
but
not...
if, for instance, they go and change their car to an EV car, right? My understanding is they have to, for them to renew their licence on the EV, they have to have the other car has more than likely be scrapped. And there is a lag in time. Okay.
But they don't have to do it until they have the vehicle purchased and in place. You know, they don't. There isn't a period.
Well, I got the impression from them that in terms of paperwork, and I bow to my colleagues on this as well, because when we went through with them, the process is they have a car. That car, say, hypothetically speaking, is 10 years old. They apply to purchase an EV car. They're, as part of the scheme overall, they're getting a grant, but they're also benefiting from the scrappage on the old car. So it's an overall package. For them to renew and say in that interim period, their licence itself comes up for renewal. Our understanding is that for them to be able to, number one, they can't drive a car that's over 10 years, so therefore the car is parked in the forecourts. They can't renew their licence unless they're driving a vehicle, and they can't go with the EV one unless they scrap the old one, and there's a time lag there. Am I correct?
But
that's my understanding.
Chairman, the vehicle age, the 10-year age limit is not there currently. It was there pre-COVID.
Okay.
It's been extended through COVID period for another 2 years.
What's the current status then?
12 years. 12, and I think it's for a wheelchair accessible vehicle, it's 17 years.
So you're saying at the moment, so you extended the disabled vehicle by 2 years to 17 from 15.
Yeah.
And so at this moment in time, 12 years is in operation, not 10.
12 years is in operation. It was due to come to a halt in 2022, and that's why drivers are concerned.
1st of January.
Yeah.
So
exactly.
you've gone out to consultation now to extend that to 15.
Even further.
To 15 years, another 3 years.
Yes.
And what's the time period in that consultation? When would you make a decision?
Well, 21 days is what we have to, you know, is the statutory consultation
period. So when that comes
period.
back, what's the process then to extend? Does it have to go for an SI?
Yeah, but that's a very quick, the next process is that it formally gets approved by our board. So we do a report to our board, and we will do that as quickly as we possibly can.
That's to be very welcomed.
Yeah.
That's to be very welcomed.
And so we're responding now to a different kind of emergency. We're gone post-COVID now, hopefully. There's a high demand for services. The economy's returned. We know at peak times people are looking for for services, particularly in the cities, and we can't afford as a country to have a loss of to the industry at the same time when we know the industry cannot put their hand on vehicles, whether they're electric vehicles or second-hand vehicles.
Well, then I'm going to hand back to my colleague, but that's to be very welcome.
But at the same time, the ambition for the industry is that we get back to a position, because also part of the regulation is that we have a wind-out
How long
process.
will you extend this to 15 years for?
It's up till the end of 2025, and then we want to roll it back over a 3-year period to get back to 10 years. So, and the reason why is that this is a public service vehicle that's been operated, you know. So the taxi driver is carrying members of the public in their vehicle, and it's appropriate that the vehicle is of a high standard. And 10-year vehicles, when they do go forward for their NCTs, have a high failure rate after 10 years. So yes, they're required to have an NCT, and actually we recognise that because of the quality of the vehicle after driving for 10 years, we require that the NCT is carried out every 6 months on a vehicle over 10 years.
We can take it now, and we very much welcome that the public consultation has started on Monday.
Yep.
That means that 21 days, that will bring us up to roughly about near the end of October.
Mid-October.
Mid-October, that comes back, you go out with get the SI changed, and you'll be announcing that the vehicles for taxi cars will be extended for 15 years up to the end of 2025, and then the rollback then for the following 3 years would be what?
It would be post-2025.
Would be what? What would be the
come back, I think it's a year in age, and then another 2 years the following year, and another 2 years, so we go back to 10 years.
If I
my apologies.
could, and you know, I understand it's just I have to go to another meeting shortly, and I wouldn't mind just getting answers to my questions. Look, I'm sure the taxi drivers will welcome the disposition that is being shown here, if that comes to pass. But I would underline, and I would ask you to respond to this, that frankly the reason we've got here, this isn't in any way to sort of cast aspersions on yourselves, but to my mind the reason we've got here is because the taxi representative groups have made their voices heard, right? And that they came in here, they got themselves organised particularly during COVID, made their voices heard. They've been making requests, they've been pointing out the difficulties that they are facing, and as a result, the system begins to respond, okay? Now, to me, there's a lesson to take out of that, and that is you've got to engage directly with the taxi representative groups. And they have said repeatedly that the TAC is not fit for purpose. It is not a suitable vehicle, pardon the pun, to sort of for negotiations between the people who work on the coalface in the taxi industry and the NTA and the department. And I really think...
What I would set out, Deputy, is that the vehicle age is not an issue that just arose in the last few years. Ever since we've introduced that regulatory requirement in terms of a 10-year maximum vehicle age, that has been an issue for the representatives of the taxi industry since that day.
I don't blame
that was introduced. So this is not a new issue. It's always been an issue.
No, indeed, but it became a life and death issue, and is a life and death issue at this moment.
And we responded to that during the COVID period, and we're now responding to it as a result of other issues, which relates to vehicle supply and relates to the fact that there's a very high...
But I will say, Ms Graham, just to say, I don't really accept the rationale. I never understood the rationale. You know, when you say taxis should be of a high standard, sure, but I mean, there's an implication that passing an NCT means that other cars are out there on the road are not passing. If they don't pass the NCT, they don't pass it. But they do pass it, but they have an extra hurdle to jump over, which to my mind there's simply no justification for. I mean, either a car passes the NCT or it doesn't. It's suitable for the road or it's not suitable for the road.
And I'm just saying that there's an indication that a vehicle of a particular age, given the level of failures of an NCT, just shows that there's particular investment required in a vehicle of an age, and that just puts another pressure on the taxi industry to keep their vehicle equipped and in a safe position to be able to offer a service to the public. So it's just that is the position, And just in terms of subsidising the system, you know, the grants that are provided, whether it's for the wheelchair grant, which has been in place for a number of years now, and now the very high level of grant to transfer a vehicle as an electric grant, would be, you know, that is the state subsidising the replacement of vehicles in the industry. You know, I think we spent on certainly there's, I think about 15 million set aside on the EV grant this year, and then another 2 million on wheelchair accessible. So you're in that kind of order that the state is expending each year now to subsidise the industry to change their.
I would just make the case, okay, that we now discover, okay, we should have known for many years, in my opinion, but we now discovered that the taxi industry, particularly after COVID, because it really did, insofar as, you know, we had transport. They were key during COVID, those who were still willing to work, and now we discover with shortages and so on how much we need taxi drivers, how important they are. But they're the most precarious situation of anybody in the public transport system. Do you know what I mean? We wouldn't say, sure, we'll just see how things go with buses. If they can make it, if they can afford it, if they can, you know, we wouldn't say that with buses. We wouldn't say it with trains, but yet we say it with taxi drivers. And I would just on their behalf would like to just underline that point, that I still think there's more support needed if we take it seriously as an integral and vital part of the public transport system.
And it is an integral part of the public transport system that's regulated by us to ensure that there's sufficient and good quality service offered to customers. And there's a cost associated with that regulatory environment as well, to ensure that we are providing that regulatory environment for the customers. There's other areas where the state has subsidised the provision of taxi services, particularly in rural Ireland. So we actually offer a subsidy to provide a local area hackney where there's no hackney services or SPSV services, and we find it very difficult to actually get in place some of those vehicles and services for very rural areas. So where we find that there isn't a service available, particularly in rural Ireland, we're also we have set out that we will subsidise the provision of that service as well. Similarly with community car schemes, which again is a different form of transport, but again we offer a subsidy to try and ensure that there's a service available, particularly in rural Ireland. But in cities, given the response and the demand levels are now 25% higher than pre-COVID levels, so there's the facility for the industry to make a good living now because the demand is so high. We've also increased the fares associated with the provision of services by 12% on average, so to cover the increased costs to the industry. So we believe, you know, that taxi drivers can now recover what they may have lost during the COVID period, given the demands that are out there in the industry now.
Well, thanks, Chair, but I would just finally repeat the call that they are making for direct negotiations with the taxi representative groups on an ongoing basis.